Thanks, Caroline, for this kind and enthusiastic intro. I really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone, for coming today. I'm going to be reading from my notes. So I'm going to be occasionally looking downwards. It's not because I don't want to engage with you. It's just because I have a lot of details to remember. I wanted to also thank the Women's Library for hosting this talk, to Caroline and Katie for their ongoing meticulous and valuable support and input, to Joanne for interpreting, and of course to Dr. Yali Hashash for her willingness to take part in this program. It means a lot to me. So I'm gonna introduce Dr. Yali Hashash, pronouns she, her. Is a Mizrahi, queer, feminist, academic, and activist. She heads the Gender and Criminology unit in Or Yehuda Community College in Israel. Yali holds a PhD in Jewish history from Haifa University, was a postdoctoral fellow in Tel Aviv University in 2011, and at the Taub Center for Israeli Studies at NYU in 2012. She is a founding member of the Women's Historians Forum in Isha Isha Research Center in Haifa, and is currently working on a book about Mizrahi feminism. Her research interests include social history of the 19th and 20th century in Palestine and the Middle East, poverty, gender, nationalism, ethnicity, and reproduction. So a little bit of a background about this collaboration. I initiated this collaboration in the context of an art project I've been working on since 2019 called Crimson Throne, which is inspired by the deceased Dada artist, poet, performer, and anti-patriarchal activist, Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven. And I'm gonna get Katie and Caroline to put this name in the chat, just in case you wanna explore about her a little bit more. Von Freytag-Loringhoven lived between the years 1874 and 1927, pushed against the gender and class societal expectations and norms over time with her lifestyle and work, and as a result experienced hostility, silencing, and incarceration in her lifetime, followed by erasure from mainstream art history canon after her death. Crimson Throne seeks to portray the complexity of her character and superimpose her gender-based experiences with my own, asking questions about existing power structures between a century ago and today. As the library collections can tell us, some of them seem to be very persistent. So although I find von Freytag-Loringhoven's experiences and memoir extremely resonant and important to discuss, I was looking to broaden the discussion stemming from her life story to include more intersectional contemporary perspectives and strategies. I've been following Yali's brilliant work since 2019, and it seemed a connection between the feminist spaces she heads and is active in and the Women's Library is a valuable connection to make. I'm thrilled for the possibility to invite Yali to share her perspective and expertise with Glasgow audiences in the context of the library's inspiring ethos and legacy. Hoping this would be a first in a series of future collaborations and exchange. So thanks, Yali, and I'm going to hand over to you now.
Hi, thanks a lot. Thank you, Tom, for inviting me, and thank you, the Women's Library. Thanks everyone for coming. And I have very short time in which I need to speak about a lot of things and to introduce a lot of background so I can speak about something. So I'll try to do everything really, really quickly. And if you have questions, then I'll be happy to answer them. Since English is not my native tongue, then I might need some words from Tom or someone during the talk. So bear with me if that's okay. I will begin with a short biography just to introduce the subject matter through my own biography. I find it easier for me and maybe for audiences to relate to the different social constructions in Israel through a personal story. So I was born in 1968 to a Jewish single mother that immigrated to Israel with her parents and siblings from Libya. She was 6 when she immigrated, and it was 1951, approximately 3 years after statehood. By the time my mother immigrated to Israel, around 4/5 of the approximately 800,000 Palestinians living in the territories that were announced on statehood as being part of the state of Israel were deported. The remaining fifth, on the most part, spent nearly 2 decades under military rule. Before statehood, Jews numbered approximately 650,000 in Israel. But statehood opened the gates for a flood of new immigrants from Europe, mostly Holocaust survivors, and Jews of Islamic and Arab countries who found themselves trapped between Zionist and Arab nationalisms. For my mother's family, immigration was a crucial lifeline, as the situation in Jews for Libya was not very favorable. Yet most Jews of Islamic and Arab countries who immigrated to Israel after statehood were not aware that they would be considered as the darker side of the Jewish people. Regardless of their own reality, of their own lives, of their own histories, they would be stigmatized as lazy, criminally inclined, unable of abstract thought, superficial, driven by urges and sexual desires, etc. Of course, this is not a homogeneous view. There were always altercations about how to define people who came from the Islamic countries and Arab countries, and people thought all kinds of things. But institutional thought was very much based on these ideas that Edward Said would call Orientalism. People who came from the Orient have all kinds of deficiencies that you can describe as light or severe according to your own point of view. In any case, they needed correction. They needed to be acculturated into modernity. The ruling sociological ideas of the time saw the crisis of immigration as the crisis of people coming from a traditional place into modernity. And if you were harsh, you would say from primitive places into modernity. Accordingly to these kind of views, my mom's family joined unknowingly the vast process of proletarization of Mizrahim. The first few decades of statehood were happening in a society that was very centralized, and it did the work of ethnic division, of putting some of the Jews into the middle class if they weren't there before, and others into the lower classes. And it was very ethnically divided. Mizrahim, and this is like a translation of the word Orientals. And everyone who came from Islamic or Arab countries were called in one way or another Mizrahim. They were proletarized while others were moved into the middle classes if they weren't there before, through all kinds of state mechanisms that we might be able to get into through questions and answers, but this is like, it can take hours to describe this, as so many researches have been made on these processes exactly since the late 1970s. So like many children at her time, my mother quit school at 12 years old and went to work in a factory. And after getting married and abandoned with 2 kids, she found herself cleaning houses for a living and found that this was the best job she could keep for decades, and she retired from it when she was 70. It took me ages to figure out what kind of a reality of a social and cultural and philosophical reality I was living in, and was really in many ways a pawn of. And high school was the first eye-opener because I attended a school that was considered a good school, and it was not many children from my neighborhood came to that high school. There were there was a very small amount of children who weren't very white or very middle class or very upper middle class. Hardly any brown kids in that school. And some of the kids belonged to families where my mother cleaned houses. And many decades later, I found out that these rich neighborhoods were built and sold at cost price in the 1950s to Anglo-Saxon Jews who settled in my hometown at the very same time that very poor houses were built to become public housing projects from very bad materials and that was one of the flats that we lived in. But I was lucky enough to grow up in a period of time in the history of Israel, a very short period of time, that was the golden age of the welfare state of Israel. It was a very short period. It lasted less than a decade and a half, and most of my childhood was within that framework. So I had many, relatively many extracurricular activities that were available to us as through state funding, and that allowed me to be curious and creative. Today, all these things are like many other states of the neoliberal order, all these kind of projects are absent. Decades later, with a PhD on my belt, I found that I'm living through what I've researched. The walls that I worked to deconstruct in my dissertation or my papers stood very much constructed and very strong in the Israeli academia. It was an institute that remains predominantly white, that is predominantly made out of Jews of European descent, and who come mostly from middle class and upper middle class families, but yet insists, like many other institutions in the West, that meritocracy is the only criteria for hiring faculty. Now, the fact that the institution is white doesn't mean that the students are white. It means that the faculty is very white. So Israeli academia can be very alienating and very hostile place for anyone who comes from lower classes and anyone who's not Jewish and Ashkenazi, that is Jewish and European. And for students, in particular non-male students, this alienation is an extremely effective tool for blocking their options in the academic institute. Options to learn, options to develop, to express themselves, to get ahead, to pursue an academic career, to succeed. This alienation is prevalent in the educational habitus of the faculty that share very common socioeconomic and ethnic backgrounds, in the different syllabi that is studied, in the expectations that faculty have of students and the options that they open up for you, and in your ability to bring your own life experiences into the classroom. Now, gender departments have been opening in Israel, I think around the 1990s, and they were opened by feminists. Okay, because that was like a short biography, I had it written down, so now I will not use that paper anymore. Okay, so gender departments were opened, I think it was during the early 1990s in Israel, and they began to open in this hope that we're going to change academia like any other gender departments that were first opened in all kinds of universities in the world. But very quickly, it became clear that they're not able to change the institution. But what was worse is that what was happening, that faculty in gender departments was the mirror of faculty outside of gender departments. They were predominantly white. And not only that, but if you wanted to study gender, you had to go into the university and you had to have all kinds of prerequisites, like any university does. You had to have these SATs, or you had to have this matriculation diploma. And when you think about it, it's really quite strange that when you're a woman and you want to study bell hooks and you want to read the book Feminism is for Everyone, you need to have all kinds of conditions before you're able to do that. And Vicky Shiran, Dr. Vicky Shiran, who has passed a while ago, was very troubled. She was a Mizrahi feminist, and she was one of the Mizrahi feminist leaders in Israel. And she was very troubled by the fact that you couldn't let women who had jobs, who were providing for the families, who had life experiences that were rich and diverse, you couldn't have any place in the country where they could study gender, where they could come and contribute from their knowledge and share their knowledge with their fellow students or study from the professors. And she opened a department that was joined forces with the Open University. And so if you opened it with the Open University and you could get credit for the courses that you studied in the program, and it would go into your degree from the Open University, you could lose the prerequisite of the program. And she opened it and it was magnificent. It was brilliant. It was great. Unfortunately, she died just the next year after she managed to open it, but it continued for a while. I was the last head of that program that was eventually closed by the college where it opened. And the fact that now the only place where women could come and study gender was closed was very upsetting for me. And I was like, I spent about 2 years finding partners for a new place that will enable me to establish such a program. And eventually I was able to open it in a community center in a township called Or Yehuda. And I found amazing partners in that college, the Or Yehuda College. And it's not an academic college, it's a learning center for Open University or for other kind of courses. But within it and with the cooperation of the Open University, we were able to develop a program that combined gender and criminology studies, and that was marketed for law enforcers, for people who were working with youth, for people who were working with LGBT communities, for people who were from LGBTQ communities, for people who were part of what is called the criminal world, for anyone who was able to find 1 day a week and invest time and resources to be able to study in our program. Now, of course, what this kind of program would lack is funds, because you need to be able to tell people, you can come and study, you don't need money. And this is one of the things I'm working on at the moment, looking for funds to enable people who cannot afford to study, to have their BA to do it. So when you think of a program like that, that allows for very different kinds of people to come into class, you can see that people who enroll to this program, and we're very new, we're just enrolling the third year in our program. We opened like less than 3 years ago. And when you open it up for people of all walks of life, what you get is a very diverse community within the class. And the most important thing for me in that classroom is to have everyone's life experiences valid as knowledge in the classroom. And when you do it long enough, you realize that when your fellow students are exactly like you or very similar to you, the knowledge that you accumulate during your academic studies is so lacking, and you have absolutely no way of knowing that your knowledge is so lacking. because most of the things that you study and you read about are about other people that you never meet. And if you meet them, you never meet them as equals. You meet them as subjects of study or as informants. And especially in social sciences and in the humanities, if you do not encounter actual people and understand the importance of the ways that they engage with their lives and the knowledge that can be passed on through them, then you're really missing out on your own education. And for me in the classroom, that is one of the things that is most important, because it speaks exactly to that feeling of alienation that every Mizrahi feminist that ever wrote a paper was describing in her paper. The fact that she was either oppressed very clearly and or that microaggressions were tossed at her and she was like just feeling that she doesn't belong in that space. And one thing that comes again and again is the attitude towards the English language. In Israel, if you're not fluent in English, or if your English is not good enough, or if you don't know English at all, that's a sign that you're lower class, that you're not deserving. And you can see that, like when you get a BA in Israel, then at one point you need to pass all your English courses so that you have English that is good enough for reading articles. And if you're not passing that, then you cannot finish your BA. And you can see with people who come to study in the Open University at large and in our program specifically, that English becomes such an amazing barrier. And there's so many emotions revolving through that thing that you can see people who can drive and they can pass with flying colors all kinds of courses, but then they go to study English and it's like they know nothing. And they're so ashamed and so embarrassed over not knowing English that you know that it has nothing to do with English. It has to do with that social message that those people who don't know English, these are the stupid ones. These are the ones who come from Islamic countries. These are the ones who come from, and it's very interesting because so many people who came from Islamic countries like North Africans, they might know French, but that doesn't mean anything. Like your French means nothing. What you need to know is English. And it's just another way to shame you into saying you're not worthy. So one of the things that we do in our work in our program is we spend a lot of time talking about what English means and what knowing or not knowing English means and how to decipher it and how to deconstruct that attitude that would relieve me and let me just study English like I would study any other thing. Okay. Oh, one thing that I needed to say at the beginning of my talk is that I belong to a feminist center that is called Isha Leisha. In English, that would be woman to woman. And it's really nice to talk in the women's library because Isha Leisha also has a women's library that is, we have a huge collection of books about feminism in all kinds of languages. And another thing that we have is an archive, much like your library, but our archive is, at least for now, dedicated for feminist organizations. It's an archive of feminist activity in Israel. It's the only archive in Israel, and everyone is most welcome to Isha Leisha in Haifa. And one interesting thing about this feminist organization is that it was the first and it is the most consistent feminist organization that took the Mizrahi criticism and implemented it in the procedures of the organization. Vicky Shiran, when there were very emotional and very heated debates in the feminist movement in Israel, Vicky Shiran was one of the leaders that were talking to white feminists, teaching them about their own privilege and racism. And one of the suggestions that she made was that everything in feminism, in the feminist movement, would be divided to three, would have three representatives: Palestinian, Mizrahi, and Ashkenazi, that is of Jews of European descent. And lesbian women said, wait, what about lesbian women? We're underrepresented as well. So since that time, it was the early 90s, the feminist movement in Israel adopted the quota system. Everything should be represented through Palestinian woman, lesbian woman, Ashkenazi woman, and Mizrahi woman. Most of the organizations weren't really up to it, but Isha Leisha took it very seriously. And this is the way we operate to this day, either through hiring or through committees that we have. And another interesting thing about our organization is that we take all our decisions through consensus. And that means that no one's voice is louder than anybody else's. And if someone doesn't agree to something, then it is not accepted and it is debated further and it is studied further. So that was my debt for the beginning of the talk, but it kind of brings together the idea of we cannot create knowledge, and we cannot, I mean, we do all the time, but ideally we would like to create knowledge that is diverse. And by diverse, we don't mean all kinds of people who are rich, which is what universities understand as diverse, but all kinds of people who actually have very different life experiences that inform the knowledge that we create. Okay, one more thing that I wanted to relate to is the song that you saw at the beginning of the talk. The song by Neta El-Kayam is a song about a mother. And the reason that this was important for me to put at the beginning of the talk is this. For the Mizrahi experience in Israel, one of the things that happened and were problematic for Mizrahi women is that our connection to our ancestors was cut. And the idea is not that our ancestors are amazing and we need to celebrate them every day, but that collectively we were taught to be ashamed of them. We were taught to be ashamed of the mother that spoke Arabic, or the grandmother that was walking with her head, with a scarf on her head, or anyone who didn't have a middle-class habitus, and anyone who wasn't, who didn't have a house that looked like the right house that you saw in newspaper. So this song by Neta El-Kayam, who's a musical activist, is she has a printer there that takes out pictures, and all of these pictures are pictures of mothers and daughters. And the idea is to celebrate your mother, whether you like her or not, right? It's not about loving your mother or loving your grandmother and thinking she's the most amazing person on earth. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But to not be ashamed of her because of some kind of a cultural construct, that's a thing that enables you to just understand that, okay, this is my mother, and that's okay. Now, the reason that this is specifically important is because in Israeli research in the 70s and the 80s, the Mizrahi motherhood was constructed not only as bad, but as actually motherhood that was harmful to the children. Israel has one of the largest percentage of children going to boarding schools because the parents are deemed unfit to raise their own children. And the state would rather take them away and spend a lot of money to put them in boarding schools than to invest it in the family and help them get out of poverty. So the idea of an ideal motherhood, and Ashkenazi women were construed in those researches as very ideal, is that when you deconstruct it, you find that, wait, the Ashkenazi mother is really not that ideal. My mother isn't ideal either, but hers is not ideal as well. And it sounds really, really simple, but for Neta El-Kayam to do this clip in 2021 is still, it still feels radical, which when you think about it, it's so strange, but it still feels radical just to say, this is my mother. And thank you, mother, just for being a mother. Maybe not good, maybe not bad, but so I think we can open up for questions so that we can have some kind of a debate or discussion. Would that be all right?